here. There we go. All right, we should be good. Let's make sure we're in the chat. Hola a todos, buenas noches. Good to see you here on today's impromptu live stream. And you know what? Today we're going to talk about Lightroom, and I'm going to show you guys Lightroom tricks, but this video is not about any one topic on Lightroom. I'm hoping to get a chat going with you guys, so please say hello in there. This channel is still not super big, and sometimes these live streams don't get super big, but that's okay. We can interact, we can ask questions, and we can look at some Lightroom tips. I've been using Lightroom since before it launched, since the original beta back in like 2000, sometime in 2007, I think it was. So more than 15 years now, and time has gone by quickly. So I thought, you know what, I'm always in Lightroom. I'm always in Capture One too. I do tend to favor Lightroom because it's ahead in most of my tests. I've at times in my career switched to Capture One and then switched back to Lightroom because even though Lightroom has its faults, it's really been pulling ahead in the past few years. But I think that there's a lot of things in Lightroom that people don't know. I know we have people that follow my channel and subscribe to my newsletter and all you guys. So if you just got an email or if you're just getting a notification, make sure you hit that bell icon, that subscribe icon, because I'm always doing videos not only on how to edit, but a lot of in-camera stuff. And make sure that if you haven't been, check out one of my Shadow Hackers workshops over on the site. You know, maybe you found my work because you use my presets, you use my film tools, my black and white tools, my actions, or you have one of my workshops. But my Shadow Hackers workshop is a game changer, and it will change the way you shoot in camera. And it doesn't matter if you're shooting a digital or a little film beauty like an Olympus OM2. Everything changes when you shadow hack. But today's focus, while I'm always putting an emphasis on shadow hacking, today's focus is going to be about using Lightroom. So I want you guys to just throw anything goes. And Asker, good to see you in there. MP Norman from Georgia, good to see you. And just in case you guys are new to the channel, I am Gavin Seim. I've been a photographer for 20 plus years now. I am a PPA master photographer. For whatever that's worth, I learned a lot getting there, and I think that's good. But the first thing that I think you learn when you get some kind of certification as a photographer is that you're just getting started. And so I love photography. I love always pushing myself in photography. I love editing, but if you guys have watched this channel, you know that I talk about the fact that digital's kind of done something to the way our editing brains are wired. And it kind of makes us the whole industry. I'm talking about the best of the best, the masters that I studied with, this whole push sliders to the right, push sliders to the right. So you're always going to see me encouraging you to not overdrive sliders and also not to be intimidated by them, not to be intimidated by shadow. Iowa, Alan, good to see you in there. And let me see here. Let me make sure I have everything in place. It sounds like you guys are hearing me good, so that's great. And we got a few of us in here. So let's actually go in. I'm just going to go into Lightroom. What I have is just my general test kind of images that I'm always using in videos. This is always changing. I actually just went to Mexico City on Monday, and I got a few images. This one actually really struck me. You know, street photography is funny because I love doing street photography as a challenge for myself because everything's always changing. You really got to be on your feet. And you really got to get over this thing of like, oh, I'm pointing the camera at someone. That's sometimes the hardest thing for a lot of us. I'm a very outgoing person, but I still get intimidated if somebody stares back at you, if you're pointing the camera at them, getting the moments. Like a lot of times with street photographers, the first thing we do when we start doing street photography is we just take photos of people looking away from us because we're afraid to face right at them. I thought this was really cool down in Mexico City, which is a crazy town and always bustling. This is in Hamburgo Station, down right near the town center, actually. And I really just happened to hit this just right where I could see through the window of the driver and the Coke trucks and the bus and all the reds coming together. Speaking of reds, let's talk about reds a little bit. As I wait for your guys' questions, and please throw any question you have at about Lightroom at me, and I will do my best to answer it. But while I wait, I will just talk about the latest versions of Lightroom, and really, as with all my classes, my workshops, even most of my presets, with the exception of the AI stuff, this stuff still applies to older versions. I have a lot of photographer friends who are still using Lightroom 6 because they refuse to go subscription. But the problem with that is it's getting more and more behind. I mean, that's what, now 6, 7, 8 years old? And most of the companies have now gone subscription. Capture One really is subscription now. And so you pay more, and in general, you get less, right? I do an annual review on Capture One versus Lightroom, and in general, you get less. Isn't there something about just the sound of a film camera, like the wind, the shutter click? You guys got to see this. Let me see if I can get it up close. I just got this one added to my film collection, and I use these. I've been shooting quite a bit of film lately, and I use these in particular to shoot film for fun, but also to do testing with filmers. This is an OM2N with a 51.4, and it's got a few wear marks, like on the brass showing through on the top, but it's nearly perfect. Everything, the meters, the lights, the check, right down to the check light. It's a beauty of a camera, and so I edit quite a bit of film in Lightroom as well. And if you guys want to talk about that, we can. David in Scotland, good to see you in there. But okay, I know I get talking about my gear, but let's talk a little bit of technique. Now, you guys may have seen my recent videos. If you didn't, it's right here on the channel when we're done with today's live video. But as I wait for your questions or feedback or discussions, we can even do brief comparisons with Capture One, but I'm going to reserve probably most of that for the 2024 Capture One versus Lightroom. The new Capture One with AI tools, by the way, just came out we'll see in the review. Lightroom has a huge head start on Capture One, but I'm glad to see they're doing it. Sometimes people think I'm a Capture One hater. I'm frustrated with Capture One because they haven't been listening to photographers for years. They just do what they want. But it doesn't mean it's not a good app. It's just when you compare the cost of it versus Lightroom, and I know I'm not alone in this, after they threw their perpetual license users under the bus, a lot of people stuck with them because of that. Like, we hate the subscription model. We just want to buy the software and use it. They threw them under the bus, and they really lost a lot of goodwill and a lot of photographers. But I still develop for both. If I'm refining silver, black, and white presets or filmless presets or something like that, I'm working in Lightroom and I'm working in Capture One, and they're both very distinct. Ultimately, I can get to the same point, but they're different. But the advantages are becoming a lot less. And you guys probably saw the new color tool. If I go here, this here, I edited in this week's street photo with, let's look at our raw file real quick. So here's our raw. This was taken on the X100. Okay, this was a preset, kind of a preset with deep reds and just nice kind of filmic color from Streetist. Our reds are really bright. Now, these Coke trucks are an iconic thing in Mexico, and of course the red buses are in Mexico City as well. But the Coke truck you see everywhere. And so in my mind, I'll actually use Coke signs and Coke trucks as reference of colors in real life because they're so consistent. You can kind of rely on them because they're literally everywhere. Coke is still sold in glass bottles, and those bottles are returned. So the Coke trucks are literally in every town, even the tiny little pueblas, and they're bringing in the Coke and they're taking out the old bottles. And it's just it's a ritual that's repeating every year. Now, I know we could get into the topic of way too much sugar being consumed and all that, but it's a classic like color theme. It's just something you see in Mexico all the time. And let's just go to this new color mixer. You probably saw the video, but I just like showing more and more examples, right? So I've edited this with Streetist, And this is always how I start. You guys always see in my videos, and people say like, "Oh, Gavin's always peddling presets." Well, I make very refined presets, and I have for years. When I first started making presets, no one was selling presets. Now the internet market is selling them, and you can buy a pack of 1,000 presets, but if you take a pack of 40 that I've made, it's gonna get you a lot further. But what people don't understand, I love it when people support my work, my channel, they buy my presets, but even if you're making your own, Lightroom is meant to be used with presets. Even right down to using the amount slider, right? So if I add a vignette preset, you can see I added the streetist preset and then I put a vignette preset. The last preset is right here, and I can just turn it up and down. This is huge. Like, this is something that Capture One doesn't even touch. The ability to add a preset. So let's actually go, I don't even know, I used which effect in this. We'll do it on another photo in a minute, and we'll come back to that. Let's stay on this color topic. So if you look at a preset like this, you can see in our HSL, we have hue, saturation, luminance. And for years, this has been what I had to do essentially everything within Lightroom. And sometimes I had to really work it and combine it. Where that lacked, I have to use color curves. And these are very powerful, by the way. But color curves, you really need a preset for color curves, because the slightest twist will completely transform your photo. And then you change one thing, and then you need to go to the other curves and change that. So I think most people, unless they're using a preset or know exactly what they're trying to achieve, don't even touch the color curves. But if you build a good color curve into a preset, and you'll see this a lot in my filmic presets, my filmist, streetist, pretty much everything now, I'm using color curves to really refine those colors, because you're, with this, adjusting color along with luminance value. But in HSL, it's a little different, right? And you basically have these 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 channels. Now Lightroom in HSL has had an advantage for a while, because a lot of times, because it has 1 or 2 more color channels. But where Capture One's color was actually ahead is that you had advanced color, meaning you could make your own color slider effectively. And now we have that in the point color, which I showed you in this week's video. But for example, if I look at this, let's say just for thematics, I wanted to make this red here have kind of the same vibrance as the Coke truck red, because the Coke truck red and the Autobus red is actually very similar here. So if I go to point color, you see I got the eyedropper like I've showed you in the recent videos, and I just want to give context of how we would use this, right? So I click it, and it shows me, here's the color I selected, and then I have all these settings and I can refine. So I can go to visualize range, which turns off everything else. So I could refine the range of this to say, no, I don't even really want it to affect. So I could control the saturation range, the hue range, which is the color itself, the saturation range, which is more like the intensity. See how the Coke trucks are very saturated? By turning down the saturation range, I'm selecting less of the reds. Okay, so here. And it's putting a limit. See that dot there? That's the color I actually selected. That's represented here by this black dot. And so I can't adjust that range past the color I've selected, because, well, it would make my color not selected, which would defeat my selection. But I can use these different values actually with Visualize to have this affect less the Coke truck, the bus, etc. And you can see how well you can refine this. And in this, Lightroom actually has an advantage now over Capture One, because just by using these very visual sliders, so now you can see, we haven't changed the color yet, right? You're just seeing the color we've selected, and we've refined very carefully the amount of range that color is going to affect, okay? And we can, on a basic level, if the advanced options are closed, you can just do it with the range, which is more or less a feather tool, right? So with that, you can say, okay, let's turn off visualize range. Let's turn off visualize range and now adjust the color. And I can actually just drag it around and adjust it here visually, right? Or I can go and use the sliders. So I could say, let's change the hue, let's change the luminance. Now you see what's happening though. If we want to be really precise, we have to get more specific because we're still affecting these trucks, and it can give us kind of some artifacting. So what we can actually do, let's delete this. We can just go and put this whole thing in a mask. This is huge in Lightroom because we haven't had this ability to do these kind of selections within a mask until now, to do these color things. And this was another huge advantage that Capture One had until now. So now I have just that selected. And this is the beauty of the two ways. And you don't have to come back to this video, by the way. I just did a video last week showing you everything you need to know about using these. I'm just kind of bringing it back because it's a new feature for those of you just coming into Lightroom 2024. And I know there's the lens blur feature, and we can look at that if anybody's interested. But this is the feature. And this is what actually makes the difference. And yes, Alan, but you can edit infrared in Lightroom as well. Lightroom's white balance range is a little more limited. So I actually have, where is it? I have a Canon 5D Mark II that's been converted to infrared by LightPixel. I was actually just pulled this out and charged the batteries last week because I want to go out and shoot it and maybe do some more infrared videos, because you can just make a profile and edit the infrareds and balance out that color in Lightroom as well. And I've been doing that for years. So let me finish this, and then I'm going to keep taking questions. Please just throw the questions in there. Anything about Lightroom, absolutely anything, throw it in there, and we'll take it on. This is an open study today. It's just a casual, have fun workshop today on Lightroom. And okay, now you can see I put this in a mask, right? So I can go here within the tools, right? Here's mask 3. So all the panels here are what I have in the mask. Let's go down to point color, because we don't have HSL on the mask, but we do have point color. I'm just going to select that. Now I have to be I don't have to be near specific, right? Because you can see if I turn on visualize range, it's not graying everything out because it's only affecting what I've selected. But now, while these are very useful if you're dealing with portraits, skin tones, things like that, people oftentimes, another thing they make a big deal about the Capture One is it has this skin tone tool. But the skin tone tool in Capture One is essentially just another mode of advanced color, and it's just automatically selecting what it thinks skin tones are going to encompass. So oftentimes you have to change. It's not always going to nail that. And it still basically just gives you basic sliders, and it gives you some equalization sliders for hue and stuff, which can be useful. But to be honest, when I use Capture One, I rarely use the skin tone slider anymore. I just use color, advanced color, and HSL sliders. But now in Lightroom, arguably, this is a better tool than skin tone because you have such precise control here. But by putting this into a mask, you can also combine it with an AI mask. So I could go over here, I could go to Elegance Speed Masks, okay? I could go to Elegance and say we were working on a portrait, and we can do this. I could apply a mask, and then it would do all the work and just do an auto mask and build my 4 masks over here, or 10 masks or 12 masks, whatever I was doing. And then I could just go into any of those masks and add the point color and refine my skin tones even more along with the other masks, okay? So here is, why is my mask tab not coming up? I think we just encountered a little bug here, because when I click the masks, nothing's happening. It shows I have masks here, right? But when I click, I don't see a mask panel. I'm gonna shut down Lightroom and restart it. Now, one of the things I hear, and I actually want feedback on this, one of the things I hear is that Capture One is faster. I don't know if it's more stable, probably a little bit. I think Lightroom does crash a little more, so there's a little advantage. Because I'm actually making lists for my 2024 review. Lightroom can be a little unstable and quirky. It can be slow, but we'll see how Capture One catches up. It's hard to compare Lightroom now with its AI mask, which is really where the photos bog down the worst. There's a video on the channel here about speeding up Lightroom, because AI masks can be a real dog. And when you apply those, do those last, by the way. So if I have Elias, I'm doing like a portrait mask, it softens skin, it does my background, etc. I'm always going to edit the portrait session first. I made the mistake of not doing that the other day, and it really was a pain, because when you add 8 different AI masks, it's going to bog things down. It's going to do the same in Capture One. When they get their mask to where they can do the same thing, it's going to be resource heavy. But I think there is some truth that Capture One is a little snappier, a little faster to import, and a little more stable. I don't know if it's a lot, because it's not like I've had perfect experience over there either, but Lightroom can be annoying in this. Okay? And yeah, let's talk about that new HDR feature, NP. And let me just finish this so I stay on topic. So now we've got this mask. Now the mask panel's working. When in doubt, restart Lightroom. Okay? And so here's our mask, but we've only selected this color. Now I can just change this around. Okay? So I can change the color of this. And you can see I can use the icon here, or I can use the sliders. That's actually a really cool feature because it makes this very visual. Now I'm going to go here. What I actually just want to do though is luminance up a little bit, increase the saturation a little bit. All I'm trying to do with the Hamburgo sign is change it a little bit so that it matches the color of the red truck. A very subtle change, actually. These are the little details, right? But see that? Now I have a synergy between that. And it's just a great example, I think. Sorry, I didn't switch the screen. It's just a great example. I think. So here's our mask. Just because I didn't switch the screen, I do that sometimes. And you can see that we've just changed it a little bit. I've pushed up the luminance a little and the saturation a little. And I've adjusted the hue just a little bit, right? And here we go. Now what I would love to see is if we could take our selected color. Are you listening, Lightroom? Because Phase 1 doesn't like me very much lately because my reviews hasn't been super favorable. But I'm just going to do objective reviews and say what I think. That's what I do. I pay for all of these software. No one's sponsoring me. You can see here that here's the input out color that we selected, and here's the output that we changed it to. All right? Now, by the way, you can turn it on and off from here too by clicking the little eye icon right here. You can preview or turn off any panel to see what it's actually doing to your photo. It's a good way to balance yourself so you don't push things too far, just to kind of turn things on and off, give your perspective there. Okay, so here we go. And it works good. What I would love to see is the ability, a second eyedropper tool. So we could say, here's the color, and then we could actually take a second eyedropper and say target color. Rather than have to just move the sliders, if we could say source color, target color, and it would match them, that would crush it. That would be really, really cool. All right? Hopefully that's a feature we will see. Okay, looking here. When you select a preset and then you decided a different one, does it mix the two, or does selecting the second cancel the first? All right, that's a good question. Let me go to another photo here, since we've kind of been sitting looking at this one. So let's take a portrait. All right, let me find a portrait. Here's a good portrait. Okay, so let's go this. I'm going to reset it. Raw reset. Okay, so pretty flat raw file out of camera, which is how it should be. A raw file is like our negative, but even more flat than most film negatives. As you know, if you shoot film, every roll of film, of course, this was our presets, right? The film that you choose was your preset. That's the color profile you got. It's the mix you got. And so while negatives are kind of like the raw file, but raw files are actually more neutral and more flat typically, which is good for the sake of editing, right? So if I go to here, I'm going to go to Filmist, and let's just do something that I know is going to work great on a portrait, like Portrait 400. So let's go back to the screen, and I'm just going to browse through, and let's go to Portrait 400 Gen 2. Okay, so here's an edit right here. And you could, after you apply a portrait, you could saturate, you could do things, etc., right? Okay, now, if you look here, don't adjust these settings. Let's say you want more saturation. Don't do that until you decide here how intense you want the preset. This feature, and I show this all the time with masks, so I'll show you that too right now to answer this question that Ardon had. If I do portrait, I can now turn it up or down, right? Now, more and more, like when I make a film preset, I'm studying that film, and the preset baseline is supposed to represent that film. But obviously, Again, if you shoot film, you know this. Even one roll of film to the next, even one frame to the next doesn't always respond the same way. So yes, that film has its base and its color and its profile, but sometimes you might need to turn these up and down to get the feel of that film. So I could say turn it up a little bit more, turn it down a little bit more. I could try a different look. I could try something like an Ektar. But understand that when I click around to these different presets, so I go to Portra, and then I go to Ektar. Ektar's overwriting Portra. I'm changing the mode of that preset because those are master presets, as I would call them. That is to say, they're changing almost everything. So when I make a film preset, if I make a preset, if I make a black and white preset, it's changing all the settings and those are saved into that preset. That preset is that look and then you can adjust it from there. This is, I believe, how presets should be made. Now, you will find a lot of inconsistencies if you're downloading presets from the internet because most presets are out there, even paid ones, are just kind of thrown together as quickly as possible. They're not tested on a lot of images, and that's why they get such a bad rap. When I do presets, especially like Filmist, sometimes if you take the Ektar that I just applied to this, I've spent weeks refining this preset. And it's like, well, that's dumb. Why use a preset? I can just do it manually. I would never do it. I couldn't do that on every image. The preset is the value, so I basically can select a film. Now, so let's say I go into here, and let's change that around. I just went from Portra to Ektar. I could do something completely different. But understand that each time I do that, it's changing the master recipe. Now, when I do a mod, it's different. And this is why I always am very distinct about what a mod is. So if I say, here is the, let's go to a noise mod, for example. Okay, so let's go to high ISO filmic. This isn't what I would use here, but just for reference, okay? So this preset, let's undo that. This is a mod preset. This is how mod presets should be made. When you save a mod preset, let's say it's grain settings. I'm only saving grain settings in the mod preset. I'm not saving all the basic settings. I'm not saving the curves. So this is how, and this is how I do it in Capture One. Capture One works slightly differently, but more or less it's the same. So anything you apply in a preset overwrites the previous settings if the new preset has those settings defined. So the best way to think of it as is if I do a film preset, I'm editing everything. Here's Ektar. I can now turn it up. I can turn it down. You know, right? And so I can completely change. And it's turning everything up as part of that preset. So I could turn Ektar up to 139 and say, okay, I like this, but it's a little too grainy. Bear in mind when we look at the preview, once you go in and render the preview, the grain is actually way finer. Grain in Lightroom kind of looks a little coarse until the full preview is rendered. Notice how now it rendered the full preview, and we're seeing a lot finer grain that's more indicative of Ektar. Okay, but I could turn this up or down. So now if I go up and I say, let's add a tonal range bath to it, right? Let's click here. This is changing like shadow and highlight and contrast and just a few settings in the basics. And it's easy to go over the top. But see how this is changing the image. But notice it's not changing my color base. So whatever the last preset you applied is what's going to show up here. That's what you can turn up and down in the amount slider. And that last preset is only overwriting whatever was included in it. So I'm very specific in terms of separating. Like if you use my silver presets, for example, I've taken this even to the point of silver. Let's go to silver. Here's silver 5.3. If you go through silver, you just see conversion presets, right? All of these convert the image. And there's film looks and there's all this stuff. And you can go through and browse through and get the look you want. Okay, that's good. Then if you want to adjust something, you go to Mod Kit. And it comes with silver, but it's to kind of remind people and keep from cluttering up the main recipes. And then you're like, okay, I like that look, but maybe I turn it up and down a little bit the way I want. So I apply a silver look. And I say, here's silver skin. Now I'm going to turn it up and down to kind of balance it out in a way I like. Now I'm going to go to Mod Kit, and I can adjust different things, right? Backlight, grain. So I could go to high ISO grain. And you notice this switches now. okay? This switches, and I can turn this up or down and affect the grain. And it's not affecting the rest of it. So, I hope that makes sense. And you can notice I'm also streaming video right now. So it's lagging. And see what's happening here is we have masks as well. So, and I get that I abuse my machine, but I have a pretty powerful machine. And I abuse it in the sense that I'm live streaming to you guys and editing on the same system. But when you have these masks already applied, like this is a mask from Elegance Masks, it's great, right? But it'll slow your system down. So when you're editing a session, what I recommend you doing is you come in, you import your session, you quickly go through and rate them, and then apply a preset that you like for the general session. So I'll usually come in and apply something like Ektar or Portra 400 or something. It doesn't have to be a film look. It could be something from PowerFlow, from Belladonna. But film looks, I find, give me a very good foundation. I did a video on this recently on the channel of not over editing, just get a nice, great, natural look. So I'll usually apply that to all the images, or if I rate them first and then apply the preset, because that could be a little faster yet, because you've done nothing to them. But a lot of times I'll just apply that preset right on import, because there's been no AI, no nothing. Then I'll edit, go through, pick my favorites, change around the looks, the recipes, etc. Then at the end I'll say, okay, let's take the portraits and apply. Let me show you an example here. If I were to take this photo, let's go back and reset it. So let's start over. Shift Control R or Shift Command R to reset. Okay. Let's go here, and I'm going to go back to Filmist. I could use Streetus, but I'm going to go back to Filmist for this. And you notice how I'm always starting with a preset. So I might do like Agfa Flex Vista, and then I'm adjust the exposure a little bit, right? And so now I have this base edit, but there's still no mask applied here. So I would ideally, if I'm dealing with a full session, if it's just a few images, yeah, whatever. But if I'm doing a full session, I don't want to bog myself down, because you guys have seen how these AI tools bog things down, these masks bog things down. So what I would do is I would edit the rest. Maybe I'm like, hey, I like this. I'm going to paste these settings to all similar photos. And then I would come back, and when I'm ready, I would go to a speed mask, or you can manually mask. But I'm going to go to something that just builds my mask easily, and I'm going to say, hey, let's do a portrait elegant speed mask. I'm going to go to something like the basic beauty trio. Now this only has 3 masks, okay, so it's going to automatically run those masks, and there we are. And then just like that, and that's why this feature is so huge. With masks, if you do them manually, you have to individually adjust them. I'm adjusting all 3 masks. So let's undo that. Let's go to a full mask, so like an AI full classic. This is going to give me a mask of everything. And when I say everything, I mean lips and hair and all the separate things, all tuned, right? All tuned, all named, everything. And you might say, well, that's a little bit too much. Well, all you got to do is turn it down. You can't even do that when you manually build masks. If you're not using presets for masks, speed mask presets, you're truly missing out on what masks can do in Lightroom. Even if you make your own, it's okay. But you notice how when I make my own, when I make Elegance, all these are very distinctly named and organized. So if I actually switch, I'm on AI Full Classic. If I go to AI Full Contrasty, it changes it, but it didn't have to rebuild the mask. It just adjusted the layers because they were already there. Now, I don't want to go super far on this, and I'm actually going to turn it down a little bit, but you see what I mean. So what I would do is, for the session I was working on, I would dial in the masks and say, hey, do I like this? Oh, this is nice. Just smooth the skin a little bit, fade the background a little bit. I've got my film preset, etc. Then I would go in. I've already done the develop settings. Then I would copy just the masks. I would go down to here, check none, and then only check the masking, copy, and just paste that to whatever I needed to. And I would do that basically when the editing was done. Because like, okay, the mask works. Here's the settings I want. Obviously, I'm going to come back and review and change things as needed. But as you go through a session, you kind of refine your vision, your visualization that you had here in the camera, right? And you're building that. And so you're like, oh, I'm going to start with a film preset. I'm going to adjust this. I'm going to add a little saturation. I'm going to do a little bit of contrast, a little bit of lo-fi. Then you get to the mask. You're like, oh, I'm going to add a mask. Oh, that's a little bit too much. It looks pasty. I'm going to turn it all down a little bit, right? And so you get it all dialed in. Like, this is my favorite photo. So what I usually do, edit everything, preset, edit, additional edits as needed, usually not too much if you use good presets, but like cropping, little adjustments, saturation, exposure, things like that, the grid edit like I've showed you on this channel. Then I'll copy all that to the images and say, okay, this looks good. What about a mask? Let's do an AI mask, smooth the skin a little bit, kind of enhance it a little, not too much. Oh, I love this. Here's my favorite image. This is perfect. I'm pasting this to all of them. Then just review. Sometimes I'll break that down into groups of like a pose or a scene that was within a session. You know what I mean? Okay, let's continue though. Hope that was useful and I didn't just ramble for too long. And I hope that answered your question, Aaron. Thank you, Mini. And Ellie, yes, this is not, this will be, you can come back to this and watch it from the beginning. And if people like these Q&A videos, we'll just do these. I know we don't have a lot of people here tonight. People are probably busy. I sent this out on late notice, but yes, this video I plan to leave it on the channel, even though it's kind of long and we're doing a lot of different things tonight, okay? But if you have a question, guys, please throw it in there, any question. Or just something to improve a technique that you already know. I might have something to share because I have been using Lightroom for a long time. The HDR feature I ran is not really an HDR feature. That's why no one's really talking about it. The HDR, let's go to a different photo. Hang on, I'll show you what I mean. Let's go to this one of Yosemite. I think this has been edited with my new Autumn and Amber pack, okay? Yeah, this is Sydney Amber. So it's still on there. Look at that, I can come back and can turn it up and down. I like that. It really brings out those autumn colors in this. Sorry, I didn't switch the screen again. I'm here in Yosemite. I'm turning up this. This was from Autumn and Amber, okay? Now, here's this photo, and I can adjust and tweak things around, etc. Let's zoom in and render the preview because that noise is too much, but it's not actually, it's just the way that the low quality preview was showing it. Remember that. A lot of times you'll apply grain. So you might think this is counterproductive. We apply noise reduction, then we apply grain. I've applied grain for years and I've been a huge fan of it. Film has grain, so it does go back to that. There's kind of an organic feel. But what happens with digital is it can be so clean, especially at low ISOs, that it gets kind of this pasty feel. Especially when you start adding masks and Photoshop and Lightroom and Capture One, and you have no texture. What that grain does is it helps kind of normalize your texture so you don't get blotchiness. And a little bit of grain can actually do an amazing amount to help with, mild artifacting in a sky or something like that, where something's just not perfect. But it also resonates when it prints and with our eyes because this all came from film. And so you don't have to do a lot, but remember when you're editing, depending on how you're setting up previews, that a lot of times when you apply a grain look, it's not exactly what you think. And you need to zoom in to 1:1, let the preview render to see how much grain. Now we see how much grain I'm actually exporting with. But just a minute ago, when you saw that grain on the screen, depending on what size screen you're watching this on right now, that wasn't the amount of grain that you're exporting with because it was a low quality preview. There's a lot of different levels of previews going on in Lightroom and in Capture One as well. This new button, HDR, let's talk about this briefly. Basically, you're not going to use this. I shouldn't say that. If you click this right now, notice how I lose. It just makes a mess of everything. This is not an HDR tool. If you want to do HDR, use your curves, your shadows, your highlights. If you want to do HDR on single files that just rocks it every time, check out my natural HDR preset pack. I'll show you some examples of how to do HDR in just a minute. But this HDR button is not giving you HDR. This is HDR in the sense of HDR TVs, HDR monitors. So what's happening is it gives you this extended gamut, right? Notice here, let's turn it off, look at the histogram. Here's my histogram. It's giving you a histogram that goes beyond, so it kind of cuts it in half. Here's SDR. So we're going a little beyond normal SDR here on this modern RGB monitor. And you can see the histogram transitions here. Let's do that again. Watch the histogram. Did I switch over? Yes, I switched over. Okay, watch the histogram. Normal histogram, just like we see on the camera, and you see where it cuts off here. Normal RGB histogram. HDR, and you can see how it fades off, and there's all this extra space over here on the right. So what it's giving, HDR in essence, I have an HDR TV, But if you don't have an HDR monitor, which is actually fairly rare on our desktops, you're just going to get like this, because it changes. It didn't actually change any of your settings here when you switch to HDR mode, but it's changing, and you can see the tone curve change too. It adjusted our tone curve and gave us this extended tone curve. So it's way out. It's cool that it has this, because I think in time this will become more useful. But it's important to understand this has nothing to do with making an HDR photo in the sense that we know it. This is for optimizing imagery, and this is actually more relevant in the video world when we're doing cinema work and cameras can shoot in RAW, HDR, things like that. What an HDR TV essentially does, and I know I'm oversimplifying this, and I'm not an HDR panel expert, because this is more the high-end cinema world. What an HDR does is it's a very bright TV, right? You notice how you've seen when we buy cell phones, the flagship cell phones now, they're like 2,000 nits. These are super bright screens. That's why we can see them in broad daylight now. These are HDR screens. So from black, they're OLEDs a lot of times, their blacks are super black, and their whites go really, really bright, glaringly bright at night. That's why you have to turn them down. To utilize that gamut, they make HDR specs, like Dolby HDR, right, for movies, which allows you to have this really broad dynamic range, huge range of stops from black to pure white. And that can be really cool if you have a screen to display it. If you don't, it's gonna look like junk. So don't try exporting HDR formats and stuff like that to like share on Instagram and stuff like that at this point, because a lot of people aren't seeing those on HDR screens, and it's not even going to display them as such. This is for if you know what you're trying to do, and you know if you've been to my Shadow Hackers workshop, you know that regardless of how much dynamic range was in the scene, we still have black to white. There's essentially this 10-stop range, right? Middle gray is the middle of the histogram, left is black, right is white on a histogram. Very important to understand our histograms, and I talk about these quite a bit in my Shadow Hackers workshop. HDR extends that, I would say, by about, what, four stops? Okay? But it doesn't give you an HDR photo. Now, if you want to edit an HDR photo, you can totally do that in Lightroom, but you've been able to do that in Lightroom for years. If you go here, let's go to here on this. And this is another one that I bring up in my Shadow Hackers workshop. Here, this was taken down here in Mexico. Let's look at the raw file. Shift-Command-R, reset. It's always good to go back to where you start. Huge difference. Why did I expose this so dark? Because I was using zones, and I was keeping this from going too far, because I wanted this sunset scene, because I knew what I could produce and what the sensor was capable of. This is natural HDR for the main edit, and then masks from Elegant Speed Masks for here, right? And so you can see if I turn the masks off, this is just the sky masks right here. And I could actually, this is the Nature Classic. Whoop. And I could turn it up and down here from the Elegant Speed Mask. So I could actually dial this back, I could turn it up, and you can see it's adjusting all those masks together, including the foreground a little bit. So if you're like, oh, it's a little too much, it's too HDR-ish. But you can see here that this is the masks, and then the rest of the main process was done, which is settings. But it's important to understand that what makes a photo HDR in the sense of a photo world is that we're capturing a lot of dynamic range in the scene, we're optimizing our exposure, and we're editing that for that. So if I wanted to make low dynamic range in this scene, this wouldn't be a very good scene for it. But if I turned down, right, if I turned my shadows way down, we're getting low dynamic range. It doesn't work very good here. This actually works. It's very high dynamic range, but not in the sense of like it's this nasty over the top, everything's middle gray, right? We still have a very good use of the histogram all the way down to zone 0 and all the way up to zone 9. Because I knew exposing dark that these foreground was going to be a little darker, but that's what I wanted. Because otherwise all this stuff here, all the cactuses, will become a distraction. So by exposing dark, keeping my sky in mind more than anything, then a good edit in post-production brought this out. Does that make sense? Long story short, most of us are not going to be using that HDR feature right now. Yes, a lot of phones have HDR panels on them, a lot of TVs. Most people's computers do not. Most screens don't use HDR. when you export a JPEG to Instagram, it's not HDR. Like, this is a technical spec, and if you actually make, this is a problem for video makers and why a lot of YouTubers, even though technically you can upload HDR videos on YouTube, most YouTubers, for example, don't. Because if they edit a video, you edit this whole video as HDR with the color space and you color grade it for that wider dynamic range, and then you upload it to YouTube, and it looks bad because there's 3, 4, 5 different HDR standards, right? It's not even a consistent standard. One uses one standard, the other uses another standard. Dolby HDR, Dolby Vision, I don't even know them all because they're mostly video related. So somebody goes on their phone, one person may have the new phone, one may have a phone from 5 years ago, one person's on a laptop, one person's on their desktop. They get this completely different experience because there's no standard. So the bottom line is, I would say HDR in a mainstream sense, it's relevant if you're making a home theater system or something like that because you can optimize everything. But in the mainstream sense, HDR mode, HDR color space, as it were, isn't relevant that much to making our photos, and it has nothing to do with whether we're making an HDR photo. You can make an HDR photo like this from a single RAW file by optimizing, by understanding your zones, by using good editing. You can make an HDR if you're outside of the range of your sensor by bracketing, but it's not necessary. In the early days, a lot of the HDR hardcore types are like, you have to bracket, otherwise it's not HDR. No, we bracketed because the cameras 15 years ago didn't have the dynamic range. And now the cameras have an immense amount of dynamic range, and if you combine that with good exposure, usually you can do it in one shot. But if you need a bracket, it's okay, and then you can use a photo merge. You can do a merge in Lightroom and Photoshop, etc., to get more dynamic range and then edit. But understand that when you do that, you're not making this HDR mode, okay? And I'm guessing, I haven't even looked because I don't use this, when we edit, you can see now we have this HDR output. So HDR, sRGB, Rec 709. These are video production standards that it's using. So yes, you can export a JPEG in HDR, but it's putting this, it's not just a JPEG, it's an HDR file. The color space of the file is HDR. And sorry, I didn't switch the screen. I keep doing that tonight. The color space is HDR when you select this, right? So we've selected HDR in Lightroom, we've selected HDR here. Unless you're displaying that, the person you're giving it to is displaying it on a screen that is optimized for that exact type of HDR, they will not get the image that you expect them to. So just don't. Just don't, unless you have a specific reason to, right? If you're making a photo or something that's being used in a Hollywood production and it's going to HDR, that's a different thing. But then you're going to be doing this on an HDR screen, all this stuff. It makes it very confusing because as photographers, we were talking about HDR photography long before these video standards of HDR came out and these color spaces. HDR is essentially another color space like sRGB, Adobe RGB, etc., if that makes any sense. Okay. How would the original photo look under the new HDR? Okay, I see what you're saying. Let's go back to that. It wouldn't. I mean, this photo, first of all, this is a Sony RAW file exposed with zones to manage the dynamic range, as you can see here. A lot of dynamic range. And so I shot this specifically for this kind of an edit. But if I went into HDR mode here, it would just blow all this out. It would look like garbage. There would be nothing there. Now, I could still turn the exposure down because technically the RAW file still has it, right? It's not actually changing the RAW file. It's just extending the gamut. It's changing the color space to an HDR video color space. And what that's causing is it to look really bad because the monitors we're looking at this on, the monitor I'm recording this on right now, is not an HDR monitor. And most of our computer monitors, a lot of our fancy phones have HDR screens, but not our computers. And a lot of our TVs, if you have a modern 4K TV, a lot of times as well, you can get that HDR. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm just thinking here, if I go to, I wonder what happens. I'm just looking. Is this even in? I don't even know if this is in Lightroom Mobile, because I was actually curious what happens if we do this on a mobile screen, it seems unlikely to me. Profiles. Can I do this in HDR? I don't even know if I can do this. I won't waste your time with this. I'll play with this just to see, because I'm curious what happens and how it displays differently. HDR screens are fascinating, but they're not relevant to most of what we're editing. What else? Any questions? I'm editing from a Mac and can't find a way to export photos. Oh, actually, that was back to that HDR topic. So yes, when you're exporting, by the way, and I just pulled that up because I knew it would be somewhere in the export module, you can enable the HDR output, but again, don't confuse that with HDR photography because they're not at all the same. And they're not. Okay, before we wrap up today, this is only a 1 hour show today, and just answering your questions on Lightroom. So if you have a question on Lightroom, before we wrap up, throw it out, and I'll answer the question. Because we can do an immense amount in Lightroom. If you're a Capture One user, it's important to understand most of the techniques I'm teaching on this channel. I generally edit in Lightroom if it's not a Capture One video, but the techniques almost always apply almost identically. Most of the sliders, even in Capture One, do the same thing. It's mostly a preference. So we do these videos and we get mad and we fight each other. You know, like Lightroom's better, Capture One's better, Neo's better. And so I do reviews and tests to objectively compare that, and then I make my conclusion, and then you can make yours on which is better. But at the end of the day, these are all just tools. It's what you're doing here that really matters. It's that. Remember that. Because we all get gear and software and all this stuff, right? Just remember that. So let me go. Let's go to a photo. I haven't edited this photo yet. I just got back from Mexico City, and I thought this was kind of wild. So many motorcycles, but we had the bus and then these motorcycles, people on their phones. People are always on their phones at the stoplight. You stop at a stoplight and you get on your phone. And then the light turns green and everybody starts honking, and there it crashed. Look at that, we crashed. You know, has anyone else had this problem? And this is one thing. I would say in general, Lightroom is a little less stable than Capture One, but Lightroom has a lot more. Lightroom actually has a lot more features and modules, and those may or may not be relevant to you, but Lightroom has a lot more going on, and I think in part for that. But one thing I've noticed a lot lately, I don't know if it's my system, I'm up to date, I think it's a bug, but I don't know if you guys have had it. If none of you are experiencing this, maybe it's a glitch with my video card or something. But Lightroom is crashing all the time when I go to the crop module, and it's driving me crazy. Like, it'll work, and then I'll go to the crop module again, and it won't work. And that is a bug that's really getting on my nerves. Okay, but here's a raw file again. So I'm gonna edit it. Let's go to Streetus. I'm gonna go to Streetus, presets, and find something that just works cool with this. Let's do something like coffee and cream, but then turn it down a little bit, okay? Now, here's another new feature. This looks pretty good. Here's another new feature that, ooh, I kind of like that one better. It's a little warmer. Let's go down to this lens blur feature. In concept, it's pretty good, but let's really ask ourselves, does the world need more fake bokeh? Is, I think, the first thing you need to ask yourself. I would say this is relevant if you're doing a portrait or something and you just want to enhance the blur that's already there. So let's look at two examples. Appreciate it, MP. Let's look at two examples really fast of this, of where you might use this. If I go here on this photo, this street photo, and you can see we have a little bit, what am I shooting at f4? There's a little bit of natural depth of field fall off back here. This is all pretty sharp up here, and then we fall off a little back here. Okay, fine. I was shooting it, well, the X100 is a 50 mil equivalent, but it's 35 millimeter lens. Excuse me, 24 millimeter lens and a 35 equivalent. Let's take this and let's turn on the lens blur. I haven't even done any other videos on the channel so this because, well, I think this is useful. I don't find it to be super exciting, but I'll show you where it is useful, okay? So it's gonna analyze, it's slow, and then we can turn up the blur amount. What it's doing is it's running an AI preset to determine where that blur should fall, okay? And then you go down here, and much like the new color tool, you can turn on these different settings. You can turn on visualize depth and kind of see color overlays and all this kind of stuff. So it's a fairly fleshed out tool, quite frankly. I think they did a pretty good job on this. You can also go here, and you can kind of change the depth value. So it's kind of like you're changing the aperture is the idea. And you're adding more depth of field or less depth of field. Obviously, you can't add more depth of field than what you already have. This isn't a sharpening tool. It's just adding blur. So if you're going beyond, it's just expanding it to where it doesn't do much of anything. So you can see if I move this over and bring it forward, it's like we're changing the focus point and the depth of field a little bit. So I can move this until the bus is clear. And so this is cool. But you notice it's not perfect. In concept, this idea that we can change depth of field in post, we've talked about this for years, is really cool. The idea that I can have a depth map of the image and then I can move the depth of field forward or backward is really cool. On this photo, it's actually working pretty good, and you might be thinking, wow, that's great. We can have this selective depth of field. But notice something. This depth map isn't a true depth map. So a lot of cameras are guessing, some of them have depth sensors, but our SLRs and our RAW files don't have a depth map built into them. So it's creating a depth map here, but it's still just an AI guess. And you can see what I mean here. If you look at this mirror right here, so let's go back. Let's say I want the up to the bus. I could say, hey, I want the bus out of focus up to the motorcyclists. Well, why is the GoPro blurry, but this guy's not? See what I mean? It's not a real depth map in the sense that there was like a sonar depth map created in the metadata. Now I can do the same to the bus. Oh, I want up to the bus in focus, and I'm gonna blur everything else behind it. Okay, here we go. Pretty close, but this mirror is actually closer than the rest of the bus, and it's being blurred. So in practice, this is a lot like a cell phone. Like these effects are fun on a cell phone, and what's cool is you can change the type of bokeh. So you can get effects of like different types of lens bokehs. I mean, the feature itself is pretty cool. It's pretty cool. But the issue you have is that it's imperfect, okay? It's very imperfect. Now you can there's some tools. Maybe we'll do a whole video on this. You know, you can do some brushing in. How does this work here? Let's play with this, reset that. We can get into these advanced tools and kind of control the masking and stuff like that as well. So there's different ways to do this. And this is still early access, to be fair. And so I'm guessing this will be refined and they'll make it better. I don't want to say it's a bad feature. It's just not one that I'll use that much, because while the idea of being able to have this cool bokeh back here is great, it's not actually going to work out of the box as like this AI tool, because you can see how it's missing parts in that AI map, okay? But let's take something a little more simple. Let's take a portrait, like, okay, I think this is gonna break it. Let's take a portrait though. This shouldn't break it, but it probably will. Here's this portrait edited with let's look at our RAW, see where we started. Okay, there's our RAW, there's our Portra 800 look, okay? And it looks pretty good, right? This was shot on a 90mm f2, so it actually has really good depth of field. But I might say, if this depth map thing was really great, I might say, hold on, let's add a little more creative bokeh. So I'm gonna apply this, let's see how it does. The problem I find is it's kind of hit and miss. Whereas like the subject selection AI mask gets it almost every time. Now, it's gonna make this depth map, and then I can turn the blur up. Okay, I'm gonna turn up the blur. Okay, actually, it's working okay here because we have pretty clean lines. You see it's screwing up a little bit here. It's screwing up a little bit right here in this foliage. But we can actually blur that background more. It's dogging a little bit. Here, let me take myself off the screen. It'll put less system resources at use here, because all this AI stuff is really bogging it down. All right, come on, come on. Let's go to our blur, and we can change our bokeh. So we can get different bokeh modes. And so we're adding like this more soft bokeh. Okay, this is cool. And we could change the depth map, but it actually did pretty good. It recognized that this was front foliage. It got a little confused on this. And behind our model, it did pretty good. I would say I might use this here and there for a little bit. I'm not going to go like this, right? I use a lens. See what it's doing? That grass there shouldn't be completely blurred. With f-stop, when I shoot at f2 and I focus right, I'm getting a correct real-world depth of field, and there's a magic to that. And I get that on our mobile phones, these are tiny lenses that don't have long focal lengths, and so you need that AI. But I think as photographers, generally, we're out shooting more. The only thing I'd probably use this in practice is to enhance a bokeh a little bit, right? Not to do this over a top, like everything's blurred out and fake. We've been able to do that in Photoshop for years by just making a selection, and I haven't, because it doesn't work to make a good aesthetic. Just use this, I would say, to enhance the blur of the existing bokeh already if you want to add a little more. Maybe you were shooting at a wide angle and there's some clutter in the background. You just want to blur it out a little bit more to kind of set off, to separate. Separation of background from the subject is important. It can be created by depth of field, it can be created by color, it can be created by shadow and light, right? If we key the background, it's darker. Wow, it's really bogging down the system. People don't like it when my videos, when I'm glitchy like this, but it's because I have all these masks and everything open over here, and Lightroom and all these masks just, they really use a lot of system resources. So I think I need to upgrade. I have a 1080 Ti in here and a very powerful 16-core processor, but it still struggles a little bit. I would like to see some optimization from Lightroom. I think that is an area that probably Capture One, people are correct that Capture One still has an advantage. We're going to try and look at that in this year's Capture One versus Lightroom review. Okay, so we've talked about new features, answered your guys' questions. Everybody's getting tired, so I think I'm going to wrap up for the night. This is the first time I've done a workshop exactly, like, hey, just impromptu, we're going live, we're doing a Lightroom Q&A. I hope if you watch this live, or if you're watching it after, that you just found some useful tips. Because in the specific videos I make here on the channel, they have to be short, condensed, and they have to kind of grab your attention. That's how the YouTube algorithm works. If they don't, no one views them. And videos like this, where we can just kind of talk and chat, are good, but they get way less views. So I hope you guys found this useful. If you're watching it later, I hope you found it useful. Let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know what features are important to you, and kind of what you're seeing with Lightroom. If you're a Capture One user, what do you think? Are you sticking? Are you switching? What do you think of the new version of Capture One that's just now coming out for 2024 version? I'm going to be looking at that more too in the future videos on the channel coming up soon. And definitely, of course, going to be doing my annual Capture One versus Lightroom review. Or are you using something else entirely? I tried Neo. There's a review for it here on the channel. Fun app, but the quality of the raw processing isn't even close to Lightroom or Capture One. And so that's the problem from a professional standpoint, is you really are losing quality in your photos. Things like how it handles highlights and stuff like that, and clipping, how it handles highlight roll-off. So, I mean, it's to the point where I wouldn't even use it on a raw file. Now, I hope they change this. I'm not going to stop watching Luminar and apps like that. I also want to look at DxO. Maybe this year we'll do some DxO comparisons. I'm hearing some good things about that. Competition is good. We all know competition is good. So anyways, you guys, I will call this for tonight. Leave your comments down below and head over to seimfx.com if you want to see any of the presets or anything like that. Go to seimfx.com/shadowhackers. Put this in the link here. Woo, what did I just do? Hold on. I just made this a full screen somehow. Hang on. There it goes. So let me put a link to this. This is a free workshop. You don't have to buy anything. I do one every few weeks. seimfx.com/shadowhackers. Make sure if you haven't been to a Shadowhackers, even if you have, it's the same workshop, but not, because I'm always improving the presentation of it. I think I entered that URL wrong. Hang on, let me just do it this way. So you can actually click on it. Shadowhackers. Let's go there. There's the link for that. And by all means, if you guys liking this, if you're not using speed masks, go check out Elegant speed masks. If you want to play with those film looks, at least go download my free ones. And if you want to support the channel, buy the whole film pack. You won't regret it. It's a phenomenal film pack, and I put a ton of time into it. But if you're playing with masks, definitely integrate this new spot color tool in with your speed mask, whether you're using my speed masks or making your own. But build your mask right, base edit like we talked about, import, sort, develop, edit from a preset, refine as needed, crop as needed. At the end, use a speed mask to refine using the amount slider, because you can edit all the masks at once, to refine how you want masks if they're needed, right? Portraits and things like that generally can benefit from a mask. But if you want a natural look, you might want to turn it down and just keep it nice and soft. Then paste all those settings to the rest of your images and your session's done. You're ready to export. It's kind of a 1, 2, 3 speed edit process. And we can do some more videos on that process as well. Thanks for the comments. Thanks for being here. We'll see you guys next time. Stay safe.